I have a very special treat for you guys today. Today, I will be playing for you the first few chapters of my audiobook for Crowe, which is a novel I wrote a few years ago, and it's just been professionally produced as an audiobook narrated by Stockton Harris. Here we go. This is going to be your first chance to actually hear it. When this gets put up on YouTube, feel free to post comments about the book, what you think about it. Definitely swing by Audible, pick up a copy of it, and give it a listen. If you're not currently an Audible member, if you set up a new account, you get your first book free. You can get this book, my book, free. I'm going to get myself off the screen here and play this for you guys. I hope you enjoy it.
Chapter 1. They never spoke of it directly, for it hung between them like a dark shadow. Death. Mortality. Audley felt a surge of relief wash over him as the last of his students filtered out of his classroom, eager to be on their way from their final lesson of the cycle. The youths restrained their excitement, taking care not to disturb the intricate glasswork that occupied the surface of every table crowded into the small space cleared between the empty shelves. While most of Audley's books and alchemical tools had been neatly packed into crates the week before and readied for the inevitable transfer to the great undercity of Subterranea, the vast contraptions of shining glasswork and the liquids in them remained untouched. Most of the projects were harmless student works. However, there were a few projects that were quite volatile in nature. The door closed quietly as the last student, a bug-eyed boy often teased for his obsessive interest in alchemy, took his leave after a mournful last look into the room. The only sound that remained was Audley's heavy breathing and the dripping and bubbling of the colourful liquids as they eased through spiralling glass tubes and dropped into simmering flasks suspended over the low flames of ever-burning candles. What remained here were concoctions best not jostled, their transmutation wisely left undisturbed until the mixtures reached a state in which they could be safely handled. It was one such mixture to which the herb master hurried. Hidden away in a seldom-used corner of the classroom, and partially covered with old, moth-eaten linen, was an old still, where a seemingly inconsequential blue fluid dripped into a clear flask. A magically warmed pebble glowed orange within the flask to keep the fermenting serum at a steady temperature. For a full month it had remained there, a daily test of the dusky, red-haired alchemist's patience. Audley crouched down and examined the potion. Another day, maybe two, and he would be certain of its potency. Unfortunately, he could afford to wait no longer. A message had arrived by Carrier Crowe earlier in the day, and Audley's every thought since had been of his dying friend. Were it not that he was still watched by warders, even all these cycles after Asher Crowe was extricated from the university and declared an outlaw, Audley would simply have skipped his final day of instruction and faced the reprimand with his usual dour demeanour. He could have taken the serum and made his escape from the university under the cover of night. He could not, however, risk drawing such attention to his departure, nor could he risk being followed. Asher Crowe was, after all, more than just an outlaw. He was the most notorious outlaw in all the Bright sovereignty. A man wanted more dead than alive. Audley's former friendship with the Asher Crowe remained a reason for the Lord Martyr's men to scrutinize any out-of-place conduct to this very day. Sweeping his long hair out of his eyes, Audley lifted the flask from its place and transferred the precious mixture into a dented tin canteen, which he corked and secured in his medical case. It would have to do. Crowe had been too long without an injection. Though the message he had received was written with intentionally deceptive references to the health of her family goat, an animal that did not even exist, Claudia had made no effort to disguise her worry. Out there, all alone, Audley thought as his mind conjured an image of Asher Crowe's young granddaughter sitting at the relic's bedside. That old goat is all the poor girl has left. Audley quickly crossed the room and had his hand on the dingy brass handle of the door when he heard the clapping of boots coming down the hallway outside. There were voices, and Audley mouthed a curse when he recognized one in particular. Warder Mankoff, a troublesome man on the best of days, Audley muttered under his breath. Mankoff was making his rounds again, and Audley did not have the luxury of time to spare entertaining yet another inspection, especially not when Mankoff always made a point to interrogate Audley about his past associations and end every conversation with a veiled threat. Audley retracted his hand the way one might after touching a hot kettle. He turned and darted away on the tips of his toes, just making it into the cover of the menial space that served as his office when he heard the lock turn. Audley closed the thin office door quietly behind him, only an instant before the warders stepped into the classroom and patronizingly called out his name. Audley hastened to the tall, latticed window and looked outside. He was at once thankful that his classroom was on the ground floor, in a little visited corner of the east wing where the trees and shrubbery were often neglected by the groundkeepers. Nobody saw him drop out of the open window, and in moments he had stepped clear of the foliage and joined the crowds of students and faculty alike who milled about the open courtyard. "Off to check Widow Tillenbrook again?" the ostler asked when Audley ducked into the shack aside the stables. The home-bound woman had often served as a convenient excuse for Audley's frequent absences from the university. Well on in her cycles, the old crone was left a sizable inheritance by her late husband, and was among the university's most generous benefactors. Her estate was several hours' ride outside of Ambermain, which justified an overnight excursion, and in the same general direction as Crowe's cottage. The fact that Audley had not so much seen Widow Tillenbrook in several cycles did not settle well in his stomach, but the widow was well known to be something of a shut-in, and Audley doubted that she had shared more than a few foul words with another living soul since her husband had died. "Aye, once more before I leave her in the care of my juniors," Audley answered, "should any of them be brazen enough to face both the winter and the widow." The ostler chuckled and repeated the usual oratory about getting Audley's stiddleback saddled up, but he did not otherwise inquire as to the meaning of Audley's barb before shuffling outside. Winter was coming, and in a world where a single year spanned a lifetime, the change of seasons meant a significant change of lifestyle for all the Bryche. Audley, like all the others who were young enough to forge a new life in the world below, was expected to take refuge from the coming 25 cycles of winter in the safety of the great Undercity. In a few weeks he would be meeting with the Wizards of Firefalls to accept tenure at the Subterranean Academy. Those who would remain behind were either too old to suffer such a transition, or among the Lord Marty's selected custodians who would tend to the needs of the elderly and Ambermain University itself until the Bryche populace returned to the world above in the distant spring. As he waited, Audley paced about impatiently. Twice he wiped the sweat from his face with the grimy red handkerchief that he always kept close at hand. Frequently he pressed his face against the foggy glass of the shack's window to make sure that no warders were headed his way. Where in shadow is that damned ostler? Audley's eyes looked up to the grey clouds gathering overhead. He knew that winter, when it came fully, would be merciless and unforgiving. It was getting cold already, unnaturally cold, according to his reckoning. At last the shadow of the ostler fell across the window, and Audley stepped back, turning his attention to the door. "She's all ready for you," the ostler muttered when he ducked back inside. "Have a safe ride, Master Flack." Audley nodded and muttered something of a thank you as he stepped back outside. He found his stiddleback tethered to the hitching post and patted the fat old beast on the side of its long neck. He reached a hand up to her equine-like head so that she could take in his scent and recognize him. With cataracts filming each eye, Audley suspected that the beast was all but blind and ran her route solely on the trust that Audley would not march her into a ravine or anything that might eat her. never one to anthropomorphize. Audley had never bothered to name the stiddleback, though he often called her with some reference to her girth. The beast was fat, gravidly so, with long skinny forelegs and knobbly knees that barely seemed able to hold up her own weight, let alone his. As Audley rounded his mount, her much shorter back legs buckled, and she lowered her tailless rear quarter to the ground so that Audley could throw his medical bag into the wicker saddle basket. Slipping one booted foot into a stirrup, he pulled himself up onto the padded saddle and adjusted himself where a man must ensure a painless ride. He reached high up over her stiddle, the raised hump anatomically positioned over her front shoulders so he could take the reins. The ostler, who had followed Audley outside, unclipped the tether and stepped back when Audley tapped the stiddleback's ribs with the tip of his boots. He would ride hard, but not until he had slipped out of the university without notice and was safely beyond the reach of those who might cause further delay. Audley spurred his bloated stiddleback and turned southward, riding into the sparse woods. He would keep clear of the road now, choosing instead a familiar route along game trails through the Hagstead forest until he reached a sheltered dip between two low hills. From there, the trees thinned out into a vast stretch of grasslands. A cold wind whipped through the ringbarks, tearing the withered oval leaves off the black and white banded joints, and Audley felt moisture on his skin. He turned his gaze up to the dismal grey sky, visible through the interwoven branches rushing overhead. It would rain before long, and he had forgotten his travelling cloak in his rush to sneak away from the university without being noticed. Not for the first time, or the last, he was certain. Audley cursed Mankoff's name. Unfortunately, there had been little time to properly prepare for the ride ahead of him. Asher Crowe's very life depended upon him, and Audley's loyalty to the reclusive outlaw took precedence above all things, especially something as trivial as personal comfort. As the cloudy blue-grey sky darkened into the night, Audley wiped the rain from his face and slowed his mount. He brought the stiddleback to a trot and directed the hairless beast across a shallow stream. Tall flowering pine mixed with ringbacks on the other side, and not too far into the woods, Audley could make out the distinct shape of the cottage. Firelight could be seen flickering inside. Claudia heard the stiddleback approach, but she did not turn to the door until she heard footsteps walking across the sheltered wooden porch. Audley was finally here, she thought. When the rugged alchemist opened the door and stepped inside, Claudia let out an exasperated sigh and got up to fetch him a warm blanket. Audley took the seat that Claudia had vacated and sat his saddle basket down beside him. "How has he been doing?" Audley asked in lieu of a greeting. "He is more feverish than normal," Claudia said, taking a seat on the edge of the bed where her grandfather slept. "He's hardly stirred all day, and I was beginning to worry that you had trouble on the road. I was about to do it myself." Audley paused and raised a brow at Claudia. Claudia had known Audley for a long time, and her fear of needles was not something she'd been able to keep secret from him. She smirked and looked away. No trouble on the road, just the usual goings-on at the university." Audley began unpacking small wooden cases from his basket. "Warder Mankoff is on the rampage again, and it was all that I could do to get away without being noticed, since he's made a point of aggravating me all week." Claudia bit her lip as she watched Audley assemble a syringe and draw a bluish fluid from out of a dented canteen he pulled out of his medical case. He flicked the syringe with a grubby finger, and tiny bubbles of air floated up through the fluid. After a moment, the fluid began to glow radiantly. He slowly pushed on the plunger, forcing the serum to rise, and bead on the point. "Looks about right, and it'll have to do," Audley muttered. "Are you ready, Asher?" Claudia gazed down towards the old man stretched out on the bed before her. Her grandfather, Asher Crowe, would soon be celebrating his 108th cycle. Nature dictated that he would have died of old age more than 30 cycles ago, but he had been preserved during that time by the regular injections administered by the rugged alchemist at his bedside. The glowing serum was Audley's own special blend of herbs and magic, ironically brewed at the very university that wanted Crowe dead. The serum could potentially fuel a man through life indefinitely, and one day and one injection at a time. "It's not that I am afraid to die," Crowe had told Claudia on more than one occasion. "Rather that you are simply not ready to face the world without me." Claudia was now 14 cycles, fast becoming a woman, but not one yet. Her grandfather had taken her in when her father failed to return from the Penora reaches after the Garrick had sacked Ambley, the small mountain village where Claudia had been born. The Garrick, a savage cave-dwelling people, had been pushing back the Bryce border for 50 cycles. The attack on Ambley, however, was the first time they had come in such force and numbers as to do much harm. Few people survived that horrid day. Sitting now at her grandfather's bedside, Claudia looked every bit like her mother at the same age. She was a pretty lass, thin and small, with light blonde hair falling over her shoulders. She also had her father's intense grey eyes. Claudia watched Audley carefully, fascinated by the magic that the dusky, red-haired herb master used each day to keep her grandfather alive. She knew how to brew the life-sustaining serum, but her stomach tightened as she watched Audley prepare to administer the injection. Claudia turned away when Audley finally pushed a needle through her grandfather's jaundiced skin. Claudia dreaded the day she would have to give her grandfather the injections herself, so not a day passed that she was not thankful that Audley had given up his own personal ambitions to tend to his old friend. Crowe moaned and stirred in his sleep. He opened his eyes as he woke and tried to speak, but his voice was weak, and Claudia was unable to make out what he was trying to say. From the look in his eyes and the expression that he wore, Claudia could see that the serum was burning painfully within him. It took several minutes for Crowe's pain to subside and the magic of Audley's serum to take effect, but when it did, the change was miraculous. Claudia watched the deeply set wrinkles around her grandfather's eyes fade away. The lines that had creased his brow lightened, and his eyes became vibrant and alert. The eyes of a man 60 cycles Crowe's junior. Crowe pulled his elbows back under him and eased himself up a little from the bed. "There now. How are you feeling, Asher?" Audley asked as he ruffled his hair with a blanket to dry it. His voice was thick with worry. "Better now, my friend. My strength is returning again," Crowe said as he stared at them in turn. "Whatever would I do without the two of you?" As the sun set on the western horizon, Claudia and Crowe sat together on the old porch swing, where they could clearly see the cloud-streaked sky. The storm had moved on, and several of the world above's 16 colourful moons could be seen hovering overhead. It was on that bench where Claudia and her grandfather spent the evening in the way they spent most evenings together, with Asher Crowe passing on a lifetime of knowledge and memories, spanning each of the world above's 25 cycle seasons, and Claudia Cobb carefully committing each tale and fact to memory. Having been born a season after the Buren Revolt, Crowe had accumulated countless secrets. His stories, recounted first-hand, often predated the First Lord Martyr's rise to power and the founding of the Brylands. Sometimes it was hard for Claudia to see her grandfather as the historical figure present in his stories, but it was true that Crowe had been a powerful warder in his youth, and at one time a daring adventurer. He was the same Asher Crowe who once crossed the Easterly Sea when a rare conjunction of the moons released their grip upon the turbulent waters of the world above. The same Asher Crowe who had once led an expedition into the ruins of Roke's grave. Her grandfather had seen more of the world above than any 100 other men combined. In a world where a single year spans a lifetime, men like Asher Crowe, who could attest to seeing the same season twice in their lives, simply did not exist. Crowe's legacy was to pass on a complete year of history to his granddaughter. It was important to him that Claudia know the truths of the world, rather than the sanitized record of history found in books written to soothe the egos of the Lord Martyrs and the High Warders who penned them. Claudia knew that it was her grandfather's hope that she would follow in his footsteps. He had often challenged her to learn to use her mind and her intellect rather than facing the world with a sword in one hand and a handful of prayers in the other, the way that her father had done. Under her grandfather's tutelage, Claudia advanced quickly in her magical studies, and she could easily outspell mages several cycles older than her, even those who had received proper training at Ambermain University, the Bryland's premier educational institution for wizardry. Her grandfather had been instructing her for 6 cycles now, and with Audible teaching her the more technical aspects of science and alchemy, Claudia's potential was limitless. Claudia would have done exceedingly well at the prestigious university, but her grandfather had been afraid that she would end up consumed and polluted by the politics of the place, just as he had been when he was a student there nearly 100 cycles before. "There will be a day not far from now when I'll not be around to guide you, my dear," Crowe said abruptly. Claudia looked at him, alarmed by the sudden change of subject to one that she hated to discuss. "Nonsense, grandfather," she said. "With Audible's serum, you'll still be around when I am your age." "And what if I am not?" Crowe asked. "Well, I don't know," Claudia answered. "I suppose that I would have to leave here." "And where would you go?" "Amberley. But Amberley is no more. The Garrick burned the village to the ground, and there is nothing there now, save for the ghosts you've left behind. I would like to see it again, nonetheless, grandfather. You would climb Roke's backbone and walk to the Penora reaches to find the same death that your father found there," Crowe interrupted. Claudia looked up at the old wizard with tears welling up in her eyes. No matter how many times they had this discussion, Claudia always had to fight to block out the thoughts of her father's death from her mind. Not knowing what truly happened after her grandfather had taken her to safety weighed heavily on her. Even though 6 cycles had passed, her dreams were still haunted by images of the day that Amberley fell. In those nightmares, she would see her father riding a stiddleback into the advancing ranks of savages. In those nightmares, Claudia had watched her father die 1,000 horrible deaths. In every dream, she would see her grandfather standing at Baden's Rock, where he hid something in a small hollow beneath the boulders. If there was a meaning in this seemingly unrelated event, Claudia had yet to realize it. "He could still be alive," Claudia argued, "and he is more likely dead. You must accept that fact, Claudia, if you are ever to fully invest yourself into wizardry." Crowe shook his head in dismissal and narrowed his eyes at Claudia. "There is no room in your studies to harvest false hopes." "But why do you think it is that I study so hard, if not to one day be able to evoke magic that will help me find my father?" Claudia paused. "Or at least learn what really happened to him." Crowe started to say something, but instead let out a deep sigh. Claudia looked away and brushed away the tears that had found her cheeks. She felt her grandfather's hand take hold of her shoulder, and she tensed. A moment later she accepted a warm embrace as her tears turned into outright sobbing. Crowe stood up and started to walk away. He paused at the cottage door and looked back over his shoulder. He studied Claudia for a moment, and then turned, his words trailing behind him. "The world stands to gain too much from you, Claudia Cobb, for you to be ruined by grief." Claudia heard her grandfather go back inside. She sat there for a long while, gently rocking forward and back on the porch swing, left alone with her thoughts. Chapter 2. Far away, deep within the world below, more than 200 shouting Garracks surrounded Horace Cobb. He was fenced in with a massive Gusker, and as hunchbacked as the hairy black-skinned humanoid was, it still towered over Cobb by more than 2 heads. This particular Gusker was a recent acquisition. It was the best fighter in Pulgra's stable. Cobb could hear the familiar guttural sounds of the fat Garrack stablemaster's voice shouting above the crowd. Pulgra was certain that his pockets would soon be lined with gold, but more importantly, that this battle would prove once and for all that Atta's prized Bryce slave was merely a weak human from the world above. It was well known, even to the gladiatorial slaves, that Pulgra wanted to stab at Atta's pride, that Pulgra wanted vengeance for the loss of more than a dozen of his best fighters, including a pair of rare Eum giants that had fallen before the Bryce slave only a few days earlier. Cobb saw the Gusker stomping towards him and pushed Pulgra's ranting out of his ears. Within the Magma Forge fighting pit, Cobb dove down into the mud, just in time to evade a powerful arc of the Gusker's spiked club. In an instant, Cobb was back on his feet. The Garrack spectators cheered and threw dirty water into the arena. With each passing moment, the footing became more treacherous as the blood-stained soil turned to mud. Cobb's long grey hair was caked to his face, and something in his back had twisted during the roll. As he sprang back up to his feet, he brought the short spear up and lunged forward as pain burned in his spine. As a man of 50 cycles, Cobb was simply getting too old to be a gladiator. The spear point landed perfectly. It found an opening in the Gusker's rotten hide armour, in the depression between the arm and the shoulder. But with the pain of his back overwhelming him, Cobb didn't have the strength at hand to push the sharpened stone through the Gusker's thick skin. The blow did make the fat stablemaster wince. However, until Pulgra realized that, the strike had done little to show his newest champion. Pulgra rose from his carved seat and howled madly, thrusting a clawed fist into the air. "Your human grows old and feeble, Atta," Pulgra taunted. Folding her arms over her exposed breasts, Atta idly picked at the grey tooth that stuck awkwardly out of her mouth, even when it was closed. Atta watched the gladiators calmly. She had given her aging Bryce slave a Garrack title, Lor Sarkara, the Grey Swordsman. It was rare for a stablemaster to bother, for the slaves of the Garrack seldom survived the Garrack gladiatorial games long enough to earn any degree of fame. But this one, captured 6 cycles ago during the most successful surface raid in Garrack history, had simply refused to die. In fact, Lor Sarkara had outlived many of his slavers, having been the property of 4 separate stablemasters before Atta had won him for her own. The Gusker grabbed hold of the spear shaft and used it for leverage, fully lifting Cobb off the ground as he maintained his hold on it. It swung the spiked club and hit Cobb square in the face. Cobb felt his nose shatter. A single spike pierced deeply into his cheek, and he could taste the blood running down into his mouth and shaggy beard. He was dazed, but somehow he managed to catch sight of the Gusker raising the spiked club for a killing blow. Lor Sarkara curled up his legs and kicked hard at the Gusker's abdomen, but it had little effect. Cobb was forced to let go of the spear and fall onto his back to avoid the sweep of the club. And though the Gusker missed, a wispy patch of Cobb's hair was ripped from his scalp as the spiked club sailed past. Without Cobb's head to absorb the strength of the blow, the Gusker spun around a little too far. It tried desperately to regain its footing in the mud, but it slipped, twisted, and exposed an unprotected flank. Cobb hit the ground hard, but he realized that this was his opportunity to end the fight and bring down the massive Gusker. He bit his tongue to stave off the pain of his back and quickly got back up to his feet. From across his back he drew a short, broad-bladed sword and sprang forward. He plunged the point of the sword into the Gusker, felt the resistance of its tough skin, and then the blade pushed through. Cobb felt the resistance give way, and the blade then sank effortlessly into the soft insides of the creature. He grunted and turned the blade upward in search of the lungs. The sudden absence of breath silenced the Gusker's pitiful wail. Pulgra came up to his feet again, cursing and shouting as he threw his mug into the fighting pit. At that same instant, the Gusker's spiked club came around, and Cobb took the blow hard enough for 3 of the iron spikes to become lodged in his sword arm, sending Cobb spinning around in excruciating pain. Cobb lost his grip on his sword and staggered down to one knee, clutching his wounded arm to his chest. A shower of dirty water was thrown down into the fighting pit as the cheering above intensified. Golden nuggets began to be exchanged among the Garruk. Pulgra was at the edge of his roebuck hide stand, gripping the lava stone rail and shouting curses as loud as he possibly could. Had the Gusker had the strength left to yank the spiked club free, it would likely have taken Cobb's arm at the elbow, but the massive Gusker staggered and fell backward, losing its grip on the haft of the club. Fighting for each shallow breath, it merely sought to reach around to its side and pull the blade free. Fumbling blindly in search of the impaled blade, the Gusker's mouth opened and closed frantically with each attempt to draw enough air to breathe. Cobb made it up to his knees and used his free arm to pull the club away. Waves of pain shot through his arm as the long spikes slowly slid free of his tissue, one tug at a time. Cobb could tolerate no more when the spikes pulled free and blood poured openly from the wound. He screamed. Water came down from the crowds in torrents as the howling cheers of the Garruk reached a crescendo. Both gladiators lay bleeding together in the pit, each trying to swallow their pain long enough to rise and end the life of the other. It would seem that your Gusker champion will sleep in shadow tonight, Atta said in her guttural language, the words rolling off her tongue with a tone that openly displayed mockery. She grinned and gestured to the arena with a toss of her head as Cobb staggered up to his feet. Lord Sharkra fumbled with his buckle of his belt as he fought to unstrap it. He finally managed to yank the belt free and held one end of the leather strap in his mouth while he wrapped the other around his arm in an effort to stem the flow of blood. His eyes fluttered, and his body was pale with shock at the grievous wound. Growling under his breath and drawing upon a reserve of energy somewhere within him, Cobb clambered back up to his feet, knowing what must be done. Inshallah, Cobb whispered. Cobb left the dying Gusker bleeding in the mud and stumbled away. He almost fell 2 times, but at the side of the fighting pit he found a crudely carved lava stone pedestal that held a box decorated with bits and pieces of bone and broken skulls. A new wave of excitement washed over the crowd of Garruk spectators as the cavern suddenly fell silent. All around the arena, all eyes watched in quiet anticipation of the moment to come. Cobb became detached from it all. With each step, shadows seemed to draw closer to him. He fought hard to simply remain conscious and standing, coherent of his surroundings, shaking away the confusion that was beginning to settle in his mind due to lack of blood. Cobb swayed and tried to keep his balance. He looked up at Atta for confirmation. The ugly Garruk female grinned at Pulgra and then slowly nodded. Cobb reached forward and wrapped the hand of his uninjured arm around the prominent eum tusk that served as the handle of the lid of the box. He opened it. Kept within the box was a long, simple-looking dagger. The dagger was old and worn with rust-coloured bloodstains dried to the surface of the blade. It might have appeared entirely insignificant, if not for the desiccated demon's heart tied to the pommel with dried roshia gut. Insignificant. Nothing could be further from the truth. This blade, Inshallah, was passed around among the Garruk stable masters as a trophy. Inshallah was always used to make the killing blow, for those slain with such a weapon would not find judgment in the afterlife. Their souls were sent directly into shadow to empower the shade that was bound to the blade. It was the victor's duty, reward, and pleasure to make that final killing stroke, for Inshallah took good care of those who wielded it. Cobb took up the old blade. Inshallah, he thought. He could sense the spirit-bound demon in the blade. Cobb felt a presence in his mind, and he knew that Inshallah was acknowledging the hand that wielded it. Holding the dagger in his hand, Cobb felt somehow comforted. For a moment, Cobb forgot all about the madness all around him. He forgot about the silent Garrick spectators who watched him, and the Gusker who had nearly killed him. He no longer felt the all but unbearable pain of his nose, back, and wounded arm. All that mattered to him now was Inshallah. "Before it dies!" Atta shouted from the crowd, bringing Cobb back to his senses. Cobb could feel Inshallah's pulse beating in his mind. The demon's heart thundered with anticipation, with hunger for the taste of freshly drawn blood. It was eager to lay claim to the Gusker's soul. Cobb summoned a reserve of energy within him and stalked back across the muddy fighting pit to the fallen Gusker. It now fought frantically for each shallow breath as its lifeblood pooled in the muddy water around it. Cobb placed a well-worn boot on the Gusker's shoulder and shoved it over onto its back. He crouched beside its head and raised Inshallah to the Gusker's neck. In his head, Cobb felt the demon's presence. Inshallah's thirst was all that mattered, and the demon was insatiable. With a sudden jerk of his hand, the blade sliced into the Gusker's neck. It sliced smoothly, with almost no resistance, as if cutting nothing more than soft, freshly baked bread. The smooth slice of enchanted blade caught on the bone of the Gusker's neck. Blood came freely from the lethal wound. Inshallah's pulse throbbed suddenly, and, in his mind, Cobb could hear the demon's unmistakable laughter. Inshallah's pulse beat so loudly in Cobb's mind that each pulse brought him physical pain. Soon, though, the Gusker's blood began to crawl toward the blade, which seemed to drink of the Gusker's lifeblood. The dried section of the demon's heart began to moisten and fill with colour, renewed life. The pain subsided. Inshallah's pulse synchronized with Cobb's pulse, and pleasure replaced pain. Cobb revelled in the feeling, taking comfort in the familiar warmth that began to run through his body. He found that the stinging pain of his back and the throbbing of his arm became more of a warm tingle before becoming numb altogether. He closed his eyes, lulled his head back, and then fell over into the bloody mud. Cobb winced only slightly as he felt his spine pop back into place. Even the terrible wounds from the spiked club began to pull themselves together, the flesh mending. Cobb slumped forward and turned to one side. He lay there, listening to the guttural chanting of the Garrick, "Lo Sarkara, Lo Sarkara." But soon, all of this faded away into muted silence as Cobb lost himself to Inshallah's healing euphoria. Chapter 3. Unusual silence marked the dawn as Claudia found her way out of uneasy sleep. Most days she woke to the voices of her grandfather and Audley talking down the hall, but not today. Her dreams had been particularly disturbing, and panic filled her. She was up in an instant, wide awake, and running barefoot from room to room. "Grandfather!" Claudia called out. "He's not here!" Audley shouted from somewhere. "Audley!" Claudia shouted as she descended the stairs that led into the basement larder. "Aye, down here!" The darkness of the basement stairwell was in stark contrast to the torch-lit larder that Audley had converted into a makeshift laboratory last cycle. Claudia could see him hunched over his work table with his back to the stairs. His attention was focused entirely on his work. Great contraptions made of interconnected tubes, vials, lenses, and bubbling liquids covered nearly every flat surface of the room. Many of these were still a great mystery to Claudia. One small still in the corner, however, she knew quite well, for it was where Audley had shown Claudia how to brew the serum herself. Even now, A first precious batch of the life-sustaining fluid simmered within a clear glass tube suspended over a candle flame. The mixture catalyzed with prolonged heat. It would not be ready for several more weeks. "Where is—" Audley snapped a finger up over his shoulder, signaling for Claudia to be silent. She obeyed and moved quietly to his side, gracefully slipping around the tables and glassware that crowded the room. Peeking over Audley's shoulder, she discovered that the headband he wore was actually a leather crown, fitted with wires and bolts to suspend a large magnifying lens directly in front of his face. "They are very delicate when they are moist like this," Audley explained. His words were drawn out by the complexity of his task. Before him sat a handful of dead red and white salamanders. Claudia had often seen them on the bedrocks of the stream outside of the cottage. A puddle of milky water surrounded the salamanders, and a line of the slimy substance ran to the edge of the table, where it dripped now and then onto Audley's leather boot. In his hand, Audley held a small metal tool that was sharp on one side and fitted with a tiny scoop on the other. Claudia watched intently as Audley pried at the edges of each individual eye to loosen them from the orbits, and then she grimaced when he gently scooped each eye out and tapped it loose in the small glass dish that sat off to the side. Extracted eyeballs glistened within the dish. Audley turned around to face Claudia and smiled. The large round lens magnified and distorted his leathery face so much that Claudia couldn't help but laugh. It made it look as if she could plunge her whole arm through the space between his two front teeth. "What's so funny, child?" Audley asked, his face scrunching into deep creases as he raised a furry red brow. That, of course, only brought on a second chorus of laughter. "Take that silly thing off and talk to me," Claudia managed between her chortles. "What are you doing? And where is my grandfather?" "He's gone to run some errands. And what I'm doing," Audley said, "is scooping out the eyes of salamanders." "Well, I can see that," Claudia said. "Why?" "Spell components," Audley answered. For a far-seeing spell." "You taught me that the eyes from a bird of prey were used for clairvoyant spells," Claudia said. "Well, ideally, yes, but we're far too close to winter now. There won't be birds around here for another 30 cycles or more, if you believe what Asher says about winter. So I have to improvise. Magic is like that, Claudia. There is always room for improvisation." Audley paused for a moment, extracting another eye. "Now, you aren't going to ask me why I chose to use salamanders instead of, say, ringtail fox, or rabbit, perhaps?" He removed the magnifier and sat it on the work table. "That was going to be my next question, actually," Claudia said as she looked down at Audley's magnifier. "But I think I already know the answer." Audley leaned back in his chair and began wiping his hands clean with a red handkerchief. When he was finished, he thrust it back into his pocket and looked at Claudia expectantly. "Well, in addition to the roots, sulphur, and salts needed for most clairvoyant spells, the eyes of an amphibian are symbolic, representing the elements of both land and sea, therefore acting as a bi-elemental focusing component." "Yes," Audley grinned. "Go on." "And you're keeping them moist because water is not just a universal solvent. It is a universal lubricant. The field of view will be extended further than you would normally be able to see with a dried substitute component." Claudia stared at Audley, who looked silently back at her. She expected either a confirmation or one of Audley's lengthy and often tangent-filled explanation as to where her logic had failed. "Well," Claudia asked, "am I right?" "Right as rain, child," Audley said with a wink. Crowe was amazed at the general sense of chaos that had spread throughout the university. It had been more than 50 cycles since he had set foot into the township of Ambermain, let alone the university itself, and little appeared to have changed. The same old ivory-coated buildings towered over the surrounding campus wall that divided the township from the university grounds. and while the faces of the students and faculty that had passed in the magically lit halls had changed, their countenance and bearing remained the same as those of his era. Crowe was born almost 30 cycles after the wizard Ambermane had brought an end to the Buran revolt and united the Bright clans, beginning an age of relative peace. Not long after, the University of Ambermane was founded, and by the time that Crowe was old enough to attend, the university had grown larger and more noteworthy than the village that surrounded it, and the Fire Falls Academy of Magic in Subterranea that predated it. Crowe remembered Ambermane University as a tranquil place of learning during his childhood, and later as a place where he cast his oath aside and turned forever from being a servant of the Lord Martyr to an outlaw and enemy of the sovereignty. Each turn brought back a distant memory, and with them came a bitter taste in Crowe's mouth. If only the second Lord Martyr had been less of a fool, Crowe would not have been forced to act against the headmaster, whom he believed had become a vessel of an Ambraic shade. But as a warder, it had been Crowe's duty to protect the Bright people, even if doing so meant that he had to sacrifice his own future. Crowe was a wanted man now, the most wanted of men, and so he pulled the hood of his academic robe low over his face and moved with long, purposeful strides in an effort to avoid drawing any undue attention. With so many people filling the halls, there were potential enemies all around him. This visit, however, carried with it a special purpose, and it was one that could wait no longer. To Crowe, it was worth the risk in returning to the university he had once called home. Crowe rounded the corner of an arched hallway and walked outside onto a grassy expanse beyond. The courtyard was woody and shady, painted in shades of green with cobbled paths connecting the numerous buildings. The swiftly flowing Goldwater River cut the courtyard in half, thinning where it ran around both sides of a large island held between its banks. Visible there was the largest structure of Ambermane. It was just a nondescript tower with a rounded peak, demonstrating much less grandeur in the architecture than the buildings clustered together on the west side of the river. But the tower was quite special to Crowe. It was the greatest technological marvel of Bright society found in the world above. The Ambermane Observatory was formed from granite blocks brought by boat from the village of Goldwater in the north, and it was only as wide as was needed to keep the spiraling steps inside manageable for those who climbed to the peak of the tower, where a mammoth brass cylinder gleamed in the sunlight. The observatory held the single most powerful magnifier in the Brylands, and with it, the scholars and wizards of the university were able to study the 16 moons that orbited the world above, even the green moon, Lyria, the timekeeper, which was the smallest, but also the most brightly reflective of the moons. Lyria, the timekeeper, was so named, as it was the moon that marked the passing of the Bright aging cycles. Travelling around the world above in an elliptical orbit, it became visible as a bright green sphere, only one night out of every 365. Crowe stopped just shy of the granite bridge that spanned the river. He looked down at the mud, crouched, and drew his old wand from its sheath. Crowe pushed the tip of his wand into the mud and drew a perfect circle, within which he drew several sharply angled symbols with circles on the ends. Crowe sprinkled some yellow powder that he had prepared the night before over the magical symbols, and then spoke the words of power needed to enchant the glyph. Letting out an overly loud yawn, Audley cocked his head to the side and asked, "Did you finish reading the scrolls that I had given you?" "Yes, 2 nights ago," Claudia answered as she took a seat next to Audley at his workbench. "Does grandfather know that you gave them to me?" Audley laughed. "You know as well as I do that Asher has his way of knowing just about anything he wants to know." Claudia frowned, remembering the lecture she had received about trust and integrity last cycle, when her grandfather had confronted her about picking the lock of his private study to get a peek at some of the spell books that he kept inside. When she had asked him how he had known that she picked the lock, her grandfather whispered to her The book told me that you were looking at them. Audley laughed out loud. In that case, yes, he knows. He is the one who asked me to sneak them out of the university library to give to you. Grandfather? Claudia exclaimed. He's stubborn and set in his ways, Claudia, but you'll have to forgive him for that one of these days. He asked me to give them to you so that you'd finish reading them before you knew that he had a part in getting them to you. I don't understand. I've been griped at for 6 cycles to forget all about Amberley and the Garrock and set my focus on my studies. That I should leave the past behind me, seize my future, and all that hogwash. He always had good reasons for doing things the way he does, Audley said. Those scrolls are one of the few recounts of what the warders found when they returned to Amberley. They are graphic and terrible, but an honest enough journal of what happened. Asher wanted you to understand what your father faced there to make sure that the rest of you were able to get out of the Penora reaches alive. Why? Claudia scowled. So you can lecture me again about the terrible way that my father was killed? No, Audley said. He leaned forward and stared Claudia in the eye. He wanted you to be prepared in case he has been wrong all along. The interior of the observatory chamber was painted black. Softly glowing balls of magical light had been placed all around the inside of the chamber to recreate the exact placement of stars and moons in the night sky. The depth and complexity of the stellar recreation stole Crowe's breath as he stepped into the star chamber. It was an exhibit of fine bright wizardry, 150 cycles in the making. Located in the center of it all was a complex system of gears, within which was interwoven a series of steam chambers and coal ovens. Behind these, massive gears churned, powered by burning coal, steam, and a little magic. The massive mechanical device was able to rotate and aim the colossal brass magnifier at the night sky through a portal in the rounded roof. It was through this invention, the observatory telescope, that the fine magical art of astromancy was born. Asher Crowe had been one of the early pioneers in the field, but he was a young man the last time he had been here, and at that time only a small portion of the sky had been magically duplicated. You've kept busy over the cycles, Crowe shouted, addressing a willowy old woman cleaning the fine lenses at the eyepiece of the machine. Rogue's hand, the old woman called out. I'd been told that Asher Crowe had been killed 22 cycles ago. You look rather good for a dead man, Asher. The old woman climbed down from the observation platform using a series of ladders to get to the ground. She crossed the distance between herself and Crowe and swallowed him into a powerful hug. I've missed you, Isha, Crowe said as he looked down shamefully. More than you'll ever know, and certainly more than you'll ever believe. Knowing that I would miss you was the hardest part in deciding to do what I had to do. Then you shouldn't have done it and left me here, Isha said, pulling abruptly out of the hug and folding her arms across her chest. Do you realize what you've put me through? It was 10 cycles before the Lord Martai decided that I had nothing to do with what you'd done, and another 5 before I was allowed anywhere near the observatory again. That's 15 cycles that you owe me, Asher. Crowe stood silent and let Isha express the feelings she had been unable to let out for such a long time. He had not told Isha when he had decided to break his oath, and knowing that she would talk him out of doing what he felt he must, had forced him to leave without ever giving her the chance to say goodbye. His subsequent self-exile had no doubt put anyone who had called Asher Crowe a friend under the scrutiny of the High Warders. Isha more than any other, for times were different then, and it was well known that they were courting. Well, Isha yielded, I can feel the magic about you, Asher, and you look 60 cycles younger than you should. Maybe those 15 cycles are 15 cycles that you can give back to me, eh? Isha smiled. Crowe nodded. I can indeed. What are you talking about, Audley? He doesn't believe that you are right, Audley said. But Asher said that it was high time for him to prove to you once and for all that your father is dead. Before what? Claudia asked as she sat up straight. Her usual enthusiastic smile suddenly gave way to a trembling lip. What aren't you telling me? The serum isn't working anymore, Claudia. Not like it used to, anyway. Claudia paled. I've been having to brew it stronger for the last few weeks, and it is causing him a lot more pain than he lets on. He's also been keeping an extra syringe on him and giving himself little boosters when he feels that he needs to catch his breath. All in all, it's taking its toll on him. Claudia sat down on a nearby stool and let her shoulders droop. She stared at the floor as she struggled to swallow the news of her grandfather's worsening condition. She felt ill, and she was unsure of what she should say or what she could hope to do. At last she looked at Audley with tears welling up in her eyes. I don't think he'll be able to do it much longer, and I think that the only reason he hasn't let himself sleep in the light is because he doesn't think you are prepared to accept his passing when you cannot even accept your father's. So he's what? Claudia whispered. He's gone back to the university. Isha led Crowe out of the observatory tower and across the second bridge to the far side of the river. There were no buildings there, just a buffer of ringbarks, but as they reached the tree line, Isha drew her wand and waved it through the air. The space between two stands of trees wavered and shimmered for a moment, and then a small cottage wafted into visibility as the magical shroud was blown away like heavy, swirling fog. You've hidden it, Crowe said with a chuckle. Well, you taught me a long time ago that invisibility was much more easily woven over things that don't move than over things that do. Isha frowned as she led Crowe up the porch steps. And after you left, I couldn't think of anything more worth hiding than my own front door. I guess that I became something of a recluse after you left, Asher. A lot of us did. What splendour the cottage lacked on the outside carried over to the inside, but Isha's home was comforting in a rustic kind of way. The furnishings were simple, and most had knitted blankets thrown over them. Isha had decorated with a number of plants that Crowe recognized as having a wide variety of medical and magical properties when used correctly. Crowe took a seat at the small kitchen table while Isha added a log to the stove. A wave of her wand brought forth a low burning flame by which she began to prepare some tea. You've mustered up a lot of courage, or gone quite mad, to have come back to Ambermain, Isha told Crowe after bringing the water to a boil. Well, as far as anyone knows, I've been dead for more than 20 cycles. The last anyone would have known of me would have led them to Amberley, which is long gone now. Besides, even if I did pass anyone who knew me back then, it is doubtful that they would recognize me now. I was a much younger man then, and the magic of my serum keeps me looking a lot younger than I should, though, truth be told, I feel as old as I ever did. Crowe shrugged. At any rate, I'm dying, Isha. What could they possibly do to me now, even if they still wanted to bother? Oh, trust me, Asher, they would still bother. Your name still comes up an awful lot around here, and the fact that you were responsible for the death of a former headmaster will never be forgotten. Isha looked back and raised a brow. Do you know that the students are now required to write a parchment on you each cycle? On me? Crowe laughed. So much to do over an old man. Isha shrugged and handed Crowe a cup of hot water and a silver tea dipper. You weren't so old then, Asher, nor so modest. Well, as usual, the Lord Martyr has buried the truth of what really happened. It is not like it was the headmaster any more. It hadn't been for a long time, Isha. He was a demon, Isha. He was possessed by the shade of an Ambra. Not according to the books in the library. He was merely Headmaster Collinghodge, and very highly respected. The books say that you broke the oath and turned your wand against him. So the fact remains that if the warders knew you were here, they would be blasting down my door right now. Bah! All lies. But to you, Isha said as she sat down and dipped her tea into the hot water. So then what is worth the risk you have taken in coming here again? The two of them talked for hours about Claudia and her father before the conversation turned to the more personal aspects of their own lives. Neither had married, though Crowe had 2 sons and a daughter, all of whom he survived. When the conversation came at last to the subject of Crowe's breaking of his oath and self-exile, he at last fell silent, not knowing how to justify having made such a rash and life-altering decision without having first consulted Isha. Crowe shook his head and sighed. I would have stood by you, Asher, Isha said. I was afraid that you'd talk me out of it, especially knowing that the Lord Martyr had denounced my petition for the High Warders to look into the matter. I would have trusted your judgment. Isha stared at her tea for a long moment before she looked back up at Crowe. We could have led different lives. We could have spent our lives together. I wish I had done things differently, Isha. Crowe looked up to Isha and blinked away the building tears. I wish that we had grown old together.
Well, there we have it. That has been a preview of Crowe. So before all the Twitch and YouTube police come after me, it is my book. It is my audiobook. I am the copyright holder, so piss off. Please leave some comments. Let me know what you think of the story. It is now live and available on Audible and as well as on Amazon if you want a hard copy. But pick up the Audible. It's great. It's narrated by Stockton Harris, who's an incredible voice actor. Definitely give it a listen and be sure to give me some reviews. We'll get back to you guys on Sunday when we do our normal stream, which will be the Dead by Daylight stream. Until then, remember that Fat Gandalf loves you in the creepy way.